We actually know now that widowhood, and the ones that are in orange there are ones where there's a direct association. So we know that widowhood, there's a direct association between loneliness and widowhood, time spent alone. So not living alone, but the time, the amount of time that we spend alone, and our perceptions of our own loneliness. Interestingly, there's more research now looking into the lack of resources, both material and educational, and that you could say that now what's happening globally in terms of the economic downturn, that's going to have a greater importance. But we still don't quite know what kind of impact it's going to have. And we certainly don't have a clear picture about the interaction between these risk factors. So we know what the risk factors are, but we actually don't know how they interact with one another. So, if I go on to talking about the experience of loneliness, but I actually want to give some examples from my own research first of how how older people describe loneliness. And these two, the examples I want to give just are very broadly two categories. The first category are among so-called socially active lonely, and that was an expression that was first conjured up by Jenny Hjerveld and colleagues. And many people in this category, they have experienced something more acute, so let's say bereavement. But in some cases, it's also been a gradual chipping away. And I can think of a friend, this wasn't actually through my research, but a good friend of mine, and she described how, and she's now in her late 80s, and she described how one thing that she really, really missed, and she described loneliness around it, how she really missed was the ability to travel. She said, what I really miss is I cannot go to Spain any longer. So that's a kind of chipping away, gradual chipping away. But most part is about a sudden acute experience of loneliness. And they deal with it usually by trying to do something that will change that negative feeling to something more positive. They do it through the social networks, they join groups, they travel, they see friends, and so on. And they can almost, and I've had this happen, they can almost describe it almost like a reformed smoker, to the day when they decided to do something about it. And they use that expression of, I had to do something about it, just to retain control over that feeling, and how they wanted to deal with that sense of loneliness, this negative feeling that they have. So here is, this was a group of older volunteers. And one of the women, she gave this reason as why she became a volunteer. And she talked about having to give up her work. And she said, well, I didn't know what to do, and I just became extremely lonely. And she used this expression of loneliness as a killer. That's how badly she felt about it. But she did something about it. She knew she was actually offered the opportunity to become a volunteer. And in another study, and this was part in Newcastle, where an old lady said to me, well, I've been known to come back with a loaf of bread and spent all days in the shops in Newcastle. And my daughter said to me, she said, what have you been doing all day? And I says, shopping. And she says, ee, and all you got is a loaf of bread. And then she said, but it's not the bread that's important. And then she went on to describe what had happened to her during the day. She'd walked into town, she'd met lots of people, she'd chatted to people in the shops. That's what was important. It wasn't the loaf of bread. And this is another one, and I've actually had similar comments by other people as well. I'd do anything just to see some people, even cut the grass, because at least people stop and say hello. I've heard a similar comment in London where someone said, I go out and I water my window boxes because at least people stop and say hello. Very similar. It's that human contact. And the conversation I had with these two women was after the main interview, and one of them, she was actually really visibly emotional. She was holding my hand and just trying to explain to me how strong these feelings of loneliness had been for her. But the main thing was they expressed a desire to take control, and they did something about it. And this is Esther, who kind of acknowledged that she was lonely, even though she didn't say this directly. And she actually identified the factors that contributed to her loneliness, as you can see here. She also said, well, I'm not frightened of being, but when I go out, I like company. And so that was why she then joined a walking group. And she could possibly be one. And I've actually had this described in walking groups where people say, well, they don't say very much. They just come along. But that was it. That's the whole point. They're still amongst people, and that's sufficient for them. So the point here I'm trying to make is that these people, they have the resources, both personal and external, in terms of available groups or activities, social networks that they have. Their physical health, of course, which all of them have had, and sufficient money to take some positive action about it. And so with regards to their internal and personal resources, they're likely to have high levels of perceived self-efficacy. In other words, that they believe that they can reduce or eliminate that unpleasant feeling that they have. And actually they also have the capability to access the support. So if the support isn't there, they would have some means of finding some other type of support that they require. So I want to go on to the second group now. And these perhaps are the people who kind of live with their loneliness. The majority of people in this group, they are likely to have been lonely for quite a long time. In fact, they're probably chronically, what we've determined, chronically lonely. And their loneliness has been associated with a lack of companionship. They have quite small networks. And the way they deal with it, they cope with it. So they don't eliminate it. They don't really know how to do with it, what to do with it. They simply live with it. And in some ways, the way they handle it almost accentuates it and intensifies that feeling of loneliness. It's almost like a vicious circle for them. And compared with active lonely older people, their self-efficacy levels are likely to be quite low. And they probably don't have the personal resources to actually access activities or services. In this case, Nora, she was almost 90 when this interview took place, and she was housebound, and she had very few contacts with the outside world. But she also lacked the confidence. I mean, we could ask, well, why didn't the services come back? Why didn't the group come back to her and say, would you like to come to this outing? But she actually didn't know. She didn't have the confidence to go out and make contact either. And what she really wanted was for someone to come with some organized activities and offer them to her so she could take part in these, so that she could have some social contact with people. And for some older people, this older man, he said, Fred, he was visually impaired. And so he said, well, if you're alone for 20 hours a day, you start talking to yourself and you don't always get the answers you want. But I try to keep my mind occupied. So it was his way of at least keeping his mind active. But again, he didn't really know what to do next. So he was kind of stuck in this environment in the home. And John and Elsie, who's the other person, these two said, you know, I'm sure we've all seen people who sit in the library, they sit in the park, and they start chatting to you when you come and sit on their bench. But Elsie, she was able to get out in her car, and she would drive to a shopping centre car park, and just so that she could be amongst people. And in a way, you could say that these people, they were convincing themselves that somehow they had a social world out there. But they were dealing with strangers. They were amongst strangers. So their social world consisted of being amongst complete strangers. So what do these stories tell us? Well, first start, I think, is that the solutions here are very much left to older people themselves. And that means that people with reasonable active social networks, with supportive families, with resources, are more likely to be able to do something about their loneliness, to be able to alleviate their loneliness. And that, of course, as long as it's available. But as we've also found, word of mouth tends to be the most common way of finding out about activities and resources. And sometimes that information is given to individuals who are perceived at risk of loneliness, but there's rarely any follow-up. How often are not leaflets handed out to people, and then people are just left to get on with it? How do we know that they've actually been able to action something? If you take the lady who sat with her hot water bottle in the sweltering day, she didn't know what to do. If someone had given her a leaflet, she would not have been able to do anything about it. So it does mean that those with few contacts, few resources, are less likely to be able to, or rather more likely to be ignored. But these are just some examples, and I mean we could go on for another 2 hours with lots of examples. But just for a moment, reflect on those two groups and have a think of who is the most likely person to actually get the services and support. And I suspect that you'll find that it's the active, socially active, lonely older people, rather than the truly lonely older people who are most likely to get those services. So let's look at some of the practice. Well, in the survey that I did some years ago, and this has been borne out by some further research, it's kind of, again, Hierveld summarizes this neatly and says, well, there are really three ways. First of all, that we can increase the number and quality of relationships to desired level, decrease desires levels, well, it's kind of lowering our expectations and accepting the feelings that we have. And that ties in very much with what we've found. And interventions to alleviate social isolation, quite similar. And so what does this actually tell us about the interventions that we have at the moment? And I would suggest that most of these interventions are directed at the individual level. And so that means if the individual doesn't comply, well, it's just tough. It's their own fault, isn't it? Now, I'd like to turn that around and say, if we consider these 3 points and try to reflect on what types of interventions need to be in place that don't bounce off the individual, so in other words, without putting the onus on the individual, we might start considering the bigger picture. Okay, well, let's think about what do older people say in all of this. So far, we've just talked about what researchers say. This is what we've found. Well, first of all, I'm sure this is not new to you, is that they don't want to be done to. They don't like to be taught to be sitting in a group and be told what to do and be treated as passive recipients. They also want to have some level of control, and this has been borne out in several of the qualitative studies that I've done both in Newcastle and in Leeds. They also said things like, well,